So good morning, I'm Elaine Treharne at Stanford and teaching a class on archives, and fortunate enough to be able to talk to leading archives and librarians internationally. And today I'm talking to Tamar Dougherty, who is the Associate University Librarian at Cornell University Libraries with a special charge of rare and distinctive collections. And formerly, Tamar was at Dominican University, where she taught as a professor of archives history, classes on archives, introduction to archives, and especially thinking through issues of collective memory, which is obviously so important in relation to the traces of the human endeavour. So I'm going to start off by asking you, Tamar, how things are in week 3000 or whatever it is of the global pandemic. How have you been coping with lockdown, and how has it made you think about your work normally in a different place from the one that you're in at the moment?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. And I mean, this is a very interesting time, not quite like anyone I've ever experienced, in my life. I'm new to this position. I've been here a year as of May 1st. After living most of my life in big cities, it took some time to become accustomed to living in a relatively laid back culture of Ithaca. There's a strong emphasis here on forging a healthy work-life balance. And living in Ithaca is worlds away from Chicago or, New York City. So I'm still becoming acquainted with the geography of the paths and gorges. It's really a gorgeous place. Trees. I virtually have a forest wow. in the back of my yard. And so I only scratched the surface of what it was like to be an Ithacan when the pandemic happened. And the other side of that is that it's very isolating. I never realized what a social creature I am until this happened. I was used to going to get my scones and tea, and every Friday I would get nachos in the Commons. And so that was a little different for me. And I live alone, and, not seeing anyone for 3 months, that can be, quite difficult. But in terms of the library and how we're coping, I think there's a tremendous amount of resilience in our librarians. And I'm very proud that we've developed concepts of kindness towards each other and kindness during this extremely stressful time to ourselves, but also to our mission. It seems that librarians were born for this moment. It's always been talked about how we should be virtual and digital. And I think it was humbling, not just to Cornell librarians, but to all, librarians and archivists, that we were not quite as ready as we thought we would be in this time, to meet the demands of the faculty and the students. And but at the end of the day, I think I owe the librarians at Cornell for having survived this. And it's about making the most of our resources and about enduring this and being creative with our services.
So that's fascinating, and the whole account, and also the fact that we may not have been as ready as we thought we were. And we're going to talk about the kind of digital environment and about creativity. And your own path is really a fascinating one. You talked about having been in Chicago and New York, and of course you're at Dominican. So how did you become a librarian scholar?
When I saw you put that question, you said scholar. So I consider myself a scholar and a practitioner, both. And I think the library came for me before special collections. My mother had an affinity for libraries as a place of gathering. My brother was a Black Panther, and often they would have their meetings in a public library, and he was 15 years older than I, and I would be scurrying about in the children's section while he was at his Black Panther meetings. And little did I know I was missing a big piece of history. I should have stayed in those meetings, but I do remember they were extremely proud of who we are, as Black people. And my mother raised my brother and I alone on the west side of Chicago. And there was a period where we fell upon hard times and we were homeless. So Chicago Public Library not only represented intellectual nurturing, but it was also physical nurturing. We would go there when we were hot in the summer and it had the air conditioner, but also heat in the winter. And so I saw it as a place where I was always accepted as my true self. Right. Books can't hurt me. And, you know, normally librarians didn't either, but extending it to special collections, I really think I caught archives fever when the Chicago school system, they made us all do a history fair entry, and as when we were sophomores. So every sophomore had to complete a research project based on primary sources. I go to Chicago Historical Society, and I had never seen this kind of library where I had to put on the gloves and put my books away. You know, I couldn't bring things with me into the room. And I also was very aware that there was something sacred about the reading room and the pictures on the wall and just the care that, you know, the archivist would take in bringing out the things on the truck. And I was studying the Aragon Ballroom in Chicago. Right. And I just thought they would bring me, you know, secondary sources, just regular books, but they brought out these glorious like drawings, architectural drawings of the ballrooms. And I wasn't quite prepared for that, nor was I prepared for my presence as a Black woman in the reading room. I didn't see anyone who looked like me. Right. And I just decided from then on that I wanted to be a part of that. And did everything I could to stay in the libraries. And in college, as an undergrad, I worked in libraries. I went to law school briefly, and my mentor there was actually Tobin Sparling, who had been a rare book curator at New York Public, who had decided to become a lawyer. And so we were switched a little bit. And he said, you know, I think you would really do good as being an archivist. And so, you know, that kind of led me down that path. And I've had a lot of mentors through the years, like Beverly Cook at Chicago Public Library, who's still there. She's the one who told me to go to Simmons because that's where Vivian Harsh went to school. Vivian Harsh was the first Black librarian in Chicago Public Library. And I thought, what a legacy for me to go to the same school as Vivian. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Well, that's so rich. So your sense of legacy, but simultaneously your sense of pioneering as a Black woman in a whole system that where you can't see someone like yourself, I think is really significant and important. And the collections that you've worked on too, the way that you would seek to highlight voices that are not normally heard or at the forefront of institutional sort of policies or perhaps even collections priorities. So there's a number of things I want to kind of follow up on there, but one of the first things I want to follow up on is the way that you describe the library as a place of both safety as well as learning. That becomes really important when libraries have had to close because of the global pandemic. So that's one thing. What happens to those people for whom the only computer terminal they have access to is the one in the public library, or the only place of safety they have is that place? And then also that kind of feeds into what you've talked about, which is the physicality of the library, the space, the people around you, the noise of the trucks, the books and the maps and the architectural drawings that they bring out. So I really get that sense of the kind of embodied experience of the library.
Right. And it was like library, I guess, the grand ball, you know, of libraries. And, you know, when we look at special collections repositories as a physical space, like, I don't know if you've ever been to the Beinecke at Yale University. Even, you know, when I worked at Columbia, it was called the Pink Palace because the walls were pink. There's something special about the place of special collections. And I think that's purposeful, right? You know, to show the gravity of the legacy of the collective memory that we're working with you know, in the documents. And I like that you brought up the public library as a place, you know, of safety and nurturing. I worked as director of collections and services at the Schomburg Center for Black Culture at New York Public Library. I was there 13 months, and I'll say, after being in academic libraries for about, I think, 15 years before that, even though my genesis as a librarian started, you know, from going to that public library, it was a difficult negotiation for me to go from academic to public libraries, because there's such a reliance by the public on the library to educate them in every facet. So instead of, you know, will you help me find sources, you know, for this research I'm doing on, you know, decolonizing archives, I was getting questions such as, help me write a resume.
Right.
I feel threatened by my partner. Can you help me find resources around that? It was very different. And there's a little bit, sometimes academic librarians don't give public librarians the respect I think they deserve, because they see it as children running about in story time. But the public library has such a heavy burden upon itself that I think is a little bit more weightier than it is in an academic library. And I can't imagine what New Yorkers are going through, and Chicagoans who can't get to New York Public Library, because for some people it's shelter.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I was working in a public library last February. They just happened to have some manuscripts, and this was in New Zealand. And a lady came in who was clearly distressed, and she expressed her distress quite loudly. And I don't know, it was upsetting for her, obviously, but also to the public librarian for 25 minutes. And the public librarian was incredibly patient and kind. And I said after the lady had gone, I said how much I appreciated her response. And she said, she comes in every day. She comes in every day. So this happens to the librarians. And this is it was such a moment of, well, I suppose, realization for me that it is a place of sanctuary, a place of familiarity for so many people. And the public librarians just, yeah, they're absolutely incredible. I totally agree with you. And really remarkable. And academic librarians too, because faculty can and students can often be not the easiest of people to work with. So now you're talking about sort of the welcome and how important it is to welcome people in. How do you, given the gravity, as you say, and the sort of sacredness of the special collections space, how do you try to ensure that whoever is visiting feels welcome in that space that you inhabit?
I think, you know, the first thing I do is, depending on who the researcher is, you know, sometimes you'll get a seasoned PhD student who's used to working in archives, or a scholar such as yourself, but sometimes you get a genealogist who has never worked with archives before and just wants to do simple research on their family, or it's the student whose professor has sent them there for the first time. And there's always this look of intimidation and fear of touching things. And so I first try to relax them and say, it's okay, that we want you to use these things. And also, I very much like to bring down barriers that cause any anxiety around using archives. So it used to be that you had to come with a letter from your professor, or the registration forms, I'm sure you know of these, will ask you, what was your degree? And I remember when I was working at Columbia University, when I was a Lehman curator, I had a Black male come in who wanted to just simply see how Governor Lehman had how he interacted with Martin Luther King during the civil rights era. And our form asked, what degree do you have? And the degree, I think, you know, the lowest degree was a bachelor's that was on the list of the checkbox. And so he said to me, I didn't go to high school. Can I use the archive? And I said, yes, you can. And that was when I saw how our forms can be a means of discriminating.
Yes.
And pushing people away. And, you know, I'm sad to say that I still do not see, after being in this profession 25 years, you know, going back to that story I told you about me being a young person in the reading room, I still don't see enough of people that look like me.
Right.
And not only in curator position, you know, curatorial positions or, you know, archival positions, but even doing research. And what is that disconnect that we're not filling?
Right. I mean, that's such a huge challenge in my own field, which is medieval studies. This has become an absolutely critical issue now, with so few
well,
scholars.
I'm glad you brought it, because I'm sure you're aware of the group that's called Medievalists of Color.
Yes.
And recently at Cornell, I do it's not a podcast, I guess I'll call it a Zoomcast. I don't know what else to call it. But every 2 weeks I do a meeting called the RAD Hour. So RAD is rare and distinctive. And one particular week I was focusing on people of color in medieval manuscripts. And it was Eob Darillo from the British Library was one of our speakers, and he talked about Ethiopian manuscripts.
Oh, yes.
And it was a great lecture, as well as Dr. Derek Spires here at Cornell, who talked about African Americans in print culture. And one of the things we spoke about was the lack of understanding around diversity in early manuscripts. And we had a speaker from Yale who talked about the Japanese experience, you know, through that. And Cornell has joined Digital Scriptorium. I pushed us to do that. And one of the things that I said to the board was that, you know, we must have more Eastern manuscripts in that database. I've taken, through Rare Book School, I've taken paleography and the book in the manuscript era. And I remember I wanted to be a medievalist. I didn't tell you that. When I first went into this, I wanted to be a medievalist. And one of my mentors told me that the boat had sailed for me because I wasn't rich enough. I wasn't European enough. I didn't grow up in Italy. You know, one of the great medieval manuscript curators is Consuelo Doisky, who was at Columbia. I had the privilege of working with her for 6 years. I guess she had studied in Italy and she knew, you know, Latin, and my language was Japanese. And I was told there was not a place for that in medieval manuscripts. And so that it was more typical for me to work in African-American manuscripts. So I kind of gave up that dream, you know, a little bit. And I wish I hadn't, but, you know, I've done a lot of good work doing what I'm doing, but I'm trying to make it so that no one has to hear those words again.
Right, and I think there is a movement, and it's definitely led by the Medievalists of Colour and by the Race Before Race collective, to ensure that students and younger colleagues of colour also never hear those kind of exclusionary words again. It's such a huge problem in medieval studies that it is so, first of all, sort of Anglophone, and then almost predominantly white. And there's a realization that that is simply does not reflect the world at all. Doesn't reflect the world now. Doesn't reflect the world 1,000 years ago. And it's a real struggle to get some colleagues on board. And we can talk diversity, but the real issue also is inclusivity, how you go on to put that diversity into place structurally, systematically, so that younger scholars and colleagues can flourish in the field that they choose. I'm very sorry that you didn't become a medievalist, but you are fabulous at what you do. And what you do is absolutely, like, probably one could argue more important because of the way that you bring such a rich variety of voices into the picture for special collections, and how you're able to work with such an array of people, and also to create, I think, a pathway for those coming behind you, which is so critically important. Medieval studies is, as Mary Rembrandt-Olm would call it, a hot mess, and not a very welcoming place still, despite the best efforts of some scholars kind of on an international basis. So, this idea of the welcome, and of a welcome, and also trying to open up the spaces of special collections is clearly so important. Is it the most enjoyable aspect of your job, or what do you find the most sort of satisfying?
So the most enjoyable aspect, I actually think, was I like appraisal for intellectual value, and there's a certain amount of power that comes with being a curator or an archivist. We make very important decisions about what goes into these sacred, spaces. And, what we acquire is a heavy decision as much as what we don't acquire. What we decide not to take in also says a lot about us and who we are. And so I like informing myself as to what researchers will need in the future. You have to do a certain amount of forecasting,
right?
With that, and I don't like to do it with blinders on. I like to ask faculty, what do you think will be important and in the future? And I also like to listen to different voices,
right?
Around that. So I think that's kind of, my favorite aspect. And I know it's one of the more theoretical ones, because there's a lot that's written about appraisal
right.
and our archives. Now, as an administrator, which is what I am now, I don't get to have that hands-on experience in anymore. Someone can come to me and say, we have a great collection for Cornell, and usually I'll pass that on to the director of special collections. I'm more there to advocate for the staff,
right?
The resources for them, and I derive a lot of joy because it involves communicating about the great things that we have to funders, to faculty, and other administrators like the provost.
So and again, that's about nurturing and passing on that you have those wonderful mentors, and then as in the position that you have, you're able to pass it on, pass
right.
it forward. I think that's the phrase, isn't it? Pass it forward. You talk about appraisal of collections. I don't think I realised until really very recently, talking to librarians and archivists, how significant appraisal and selection is, and especially at elite
the most
institutions.
Important thing we do. Yeah.
And so at Cornell is Ivy League elite. You have a budget that is larger, well, relative terms than many institutions.
So Cornell is the 5th Ivy I've worked at.
Right.
I've been at Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Harvard. I may be missing one in Cornell. At Cornell, we may say we do not have as much as Yale. I think the Beinecke probably has one of the bigger endowments and budgets. So we feel constrained,
right.
even in what we have. But through my work at the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, that was a project in which we worked with community archives, which I'm sure you've heard of, these smaller local archives. Sometimes it could be the shopkeeper who's keeping a history of the whole community in his basement. Once you see the precarity of community archives, I don't think any academic library could complain about their budget.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah. No, I totally agree. I've got that. There's a new book on community archives and some really wonderful essays in that. And one of the things that is pointed out by Andrew Prescott in his essay at the end is about the precarity of the community archive, and especially in the light of the fact that so many community archives are effectively, in terms of their identity or this effort at collective memory, born digital, in the sense that they're on Facebook or some other sort of social media dependency, for want of a better word. So how would you how do you sort of anticipate the role of perhaps social media or the digital more broadly in helping? So I suppose it's two things. One, just in general, except that's a vast question, but in helping to redress the imbalance in terms of whose voices are heard or who gets a say in the collective memory. I don't know, is that?
No, I think it's a very appropriate question. About several years ago, I was part of a project called Diversifying the Digital, and had a lot of great people on it, like Burgess Jules, Kira Alich, who's at the Amistad Research Center. And it was an IMLS grant to assess the digital, I guess, readiness of community archives. There's a lot of national platforms such as HathiTrust, DPLA, Digital Public Library of America, and Umbra Search. And community archives, some of them, they hardly have their things processed, let alone digital ready. And we convened 4 forums across the United States. One was at UCLA, the other Tulane, the third was Northwestern, and the final one was at NYU. And at the NYU forum, someone stood up from a community archive. It was a Chinese art museum. And he said, I can hardly keep the lights on. How do you expect me to get my archives ready to be digital, born, and forget about dealing with born digital material. So we were having these forums, and I mean, we also got kind of called out on the carpet by a community leader that said we were thinking about this from too elitist. Yeah, we didn't have the faculty to understand or be sensitive about it, and it was humbling, for us. Yeah. But we still need to be active participants in the community archive. And I think first, what we need to do as archivists and curators is to say that we're all cultural agents. It's not just something that we do. I think it's something that we all do in our work every day, even when we're not conscious of it. And I think what social media does, in some ways, I mean, how do you feel about this? It might make all of us a little bit of, an archivist or a curator. We're all putting information out there quickly. I mean, Burgess Jules has a great project called Documenting the Now that's out there that teaches archival practitioners how to document protests as they're happening through tweets. And, when you look at the George Floyd tragedy and all the protesting that was going on, I mean, here was a lot of history happening at once. We're in the midst of this global pandemic. People are protesting despite the dangers of COVID-19, not just in America, but all over. And then you see these monuments, crashing down, and people were talking about cancel culture.
Yes.
And things like that. How do you document, that? A lot of things were said on Twitter, on Instagram, and, we have to capture those moments. So I think it might be prudent for us to put a little bit of archivist in everyone, because I don't think we can all do it.
That is, I mean, I'm trying to scribble. I know this is recorded, but I'm still trying to scribble down some of these insights some of these insights that you're bringing to the table. And I think that is absolutely right. If you are able to, because I read a lot of uncomfortable things to read in places as broad as like South Wales, where I'm from, and people saying we're destroying history, and what about our history as these monuments? And it's like, no, this is history right now. Right. This is history, and this is trying to create a new history that seeks to, begin reparation. And
well, I think one of my favorite scholars of collective memory is Pierre Nora.
Yes.
And I always liked that he my French is terrible, but he had a term for places of memory, and how archives and museums are places where memory crystallizes. and he would talk about commemoration and memorialization of people. And, when you see these statues, these figures, which are usually male, that's another thing. In a way, you're deifying someone who may or may not have been a good person. And when you see them there, in the park, also the fact that our resources goes into preserving these statues, you are elevating their legacy above others. At first I was against taking down these statues because I thought maybe you should have General Lee there, or in order to remember the bad things that they may have done. But now I am buying into it a bit and thinking of replacing them with better legacies. I know that there's a very stark lack of representation of women in commemorative statues.
Yes, yeah, and I it does extend to the archive, doesn't it? We on campus we've changed the names of some of the streets because of the missions which Europeanized the West Coast, but also had genocidal consequences for Native American peoples. And so we've changed the names, and then in the archives we own some of these objects of the missionaries, and was the time then we would get them out and kind of laud and applaud this kind of archival material, or that was special collections material actually. And I would hope that now there's a far better effort in our own teams to represent other sides of these stories, and as you say, especially women and minorities. I think it's really critical. So we're going to have to round off, and I have about 1,000 other questions to ask you, and I'm so full of I don't know, just a kind of it's incredible talking to you. And so perhaps just in terms of where we're at the moment, what do you think is the biggest challenge that you face in your role working at Cornell with these special collections, and in your administrative capacity too?
So I'm very lucky that I have a really good supporter in Gerald Beasley, our university librarian. He comes from a special collections background. He used to be director of the Avery Library at Columbia. And he also, I think, worked at, there's something in the UK called the Welcome.
Yes. The
Welcome Project. He worked there as well. And it's not typical to see someone with a special collections background be a university librarian. We're lucky that I think now America is seeing the importance of the associate university librarian for rare and distinctive collections. So my position is new at Cornell. The biggest challenge is getting us to embrace area studies,
right,
as a distinctive collection. So I also have the Croc Asia division that reports to me, which we have beautiful rare collections, but also distinctive things that are ephemeral that may be circulating. I also now, as of last week, the Africana library reports to me as well. So we're starting to recognize area studies units as being part of the rare and distinctive collections conversation, but also resources. Again, resources. I'm hoping that this pandemic, what everybody has learned is, I think everyone thought the library was important, but I'm hoping faculty see it even more so. A lot of times I think faculty don't see how hard decisions are for us. And I was here at a barbecue, and the faculty member was really angry because Cornell had canceled a journal of Christology. And I'm not the AUL responsible for that, but because she heard I was at AUL, she thought I was. And we didn't want to make that decision, but it was a matter of lack of circulation and lack of resources. And I wish more faculty would understand that we need to advocate to our provosts how much the library needs sometimes.
Right, exactly. Yeah, again, you know, so I've heard faculty complain like that too, and so it's advocating and about resources, but also about the broadening of what we do to be more inclusive and to bring in different aspects. And that goes back to what you were saying about your RAD hour, where you're trying to ensure that other manuscripts of
well, and I also have the RAD hour meetings, one, so faculty can see the rich collections that we have. They can see the talent that we have in the libraries. You know, the RAD hour also includes our colleagues from other institutions, so we can build collaborations, because funders love collaboration, because they want to stretch just every dollar, and that's understandable. I think, you know, the funders like Mellon, Clear, IMLS, you know, they want to see us do more with less, because there's so many people that need, you know, so many institutions that need things. And, you know, just to bring up digitization, I wish we had digitized more. You know, and COVID, you know, showed us that. And when the digital movement first happened with archives, we were told to always digitize what was visually appealing.
Right.
And that's not really the bread and butter sometimes of what the faculty need to do their research. And so, you know, we have a witchcraft, one of the largest witchcraft collections here at Cornell. That's something, you know, we've digitized a lot. We have beautiful botanicals, cyanotypes. But what are the faculty asking for when you're in a global pandemic and you can't get to your physical collections?
Not those things.
Right, right.
Yeah, that, and also in trying to teach archives and primary sources, I'm becoming very aware of how some of the largest kind of national projects provide us with the, you know, the Walpole and the Alexander Pope stuff, but the
Walpole, I know Walpole, right?
Yeah, the nitty gritty, the other kind, you know, you want other materials, and they're not there. So this has been incredibly instructive and rich, and you've discussed so much that I know my students and others watching this will mull over, and I really hope we get to hear a lot more from you, and the work that you're doing is fantastic.
And maybe you'll do a RAD hour.
Maybe I'll do a RAD hour. I thank you so very much for joining us, Tamar. I've really enjoyed it and learned a tremendous amount, and I'll be following you with interest on Twitter and in the RAD hour and everything else where I can see what you're up to at Cornell.
Well, thank you for having me. You're my bibliotherapy for today.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.